As we start heading south from Washington Heights, we come into the neighborhood of Harlem. Harlem is a neighborhood in the borough of Manhattan, which since the 1920s has been a major African-American residential, cultural, and business center. Originally a Dutch village formally organized in 1658, it is named after the city of Harlem in the Netherlands. Harlem was annexed to New York City in 1873. Harlem has been defined by a series of boom and bust cycles with significant ethnic shifts accompanying each cycle. African American residents began to arrive en masse in 1904, with numbers fed by the Great Migration. In the 1920s and 1930s, the neighborhood was the focus of the Harlem Renaissance, an outpouring of artistic and professional works without precedent in the African American community. However, first with job losses in the time of the Great Depression, and especially after World War II, with deindustrialization in New York, rates of crime and poverty increased significantly. New York's revival in the late 20th century has led to a renewal of Harlem as well. By 1995, Harlem was experiencing social and economic gentrification. The Cotton Club was a famous nightclub in New York City that operated during Prohibition that included jazz music. The club featured many of the greatest African American entertainers of the era, such as Fletcher Henderson, Duke Ellington, Count Basie, Bessie Smith, Cab Calloway, the Nicholas Brothers, Ella Fitzgerald, Fats Waller, Louis Armstrong, Dizzy Gillespie, Nat King Cole, Billie Holiday, and Ethel Waters. Heavyweight boxing champion Jack Johnson opened the Club Deluxe at 142nd Street and Lenox Avenue in Harlem in 1920. Oney Madden, a prominent bootlegger and gangster, took over the club in 1923 while imprisoned in Sing Sing and changed his name to the Cotton Club. While the club was closed briefly in 1925 for selling liquor, it reopened without trouble from the police. Closed temporarily in 1936 after the race riot in Harlem. The Cotton Club reopened later that year at Broadway and 48th Street. It closed for good in 1940 under pressure from higher rents, changing tastes, and a federal investigation into tax evasion by Manhattan nightclub owners. The Latin Quarter nightclub opened in its space, and the building was torn down in 1989 to make way for a hotel. A new club with the same name opened in 1978 in Harlem. Strivers Row is 3 rows of townhouses in western Harlem on West 138th and West 139th Street between Adam Clayton Powell Jr. Boulevard and Frederick Douglass Boulevard. Different architects worked on each of the 3 rows, and they are collectively recognized as a gem of New York City architecture constructed between 1891 and 1893. David Kane's speculative development failed, and most of the houses were soon owned by the Equitable Life Assurance Society, which had financed the project. By this time, Harlem was being abandoned by white New Yorkers, and the company would not sell the King houses to African Americans. As a result, they sat empty. When they were finally made available to African American residents for $8,000 each, they attracted hard-working professionals or strivers who gave the houses their current name. In 1808, a few African Americans, armed with their faith in Jesus and straightened by mercies already seen, left the worship service of the First Baptist Church of New York City. These African Americans, accompanied by a group of Ethiopian merchants, were unwilling to accept racially segregated seating in God's house and determined that they would organize their own church. They established themselves in a building on Anthony Street, later Wirt Street, calling themselves the Abyssinian Baptist Church, a name inspired by the ancient name of the nation from which the merchants of Ethiopia had come. The Reverend Thomas Paul, a minister from Boston, aided the new congregation in becoming organized as the first African American Baptist church in the state of New York. The Claremont Theater building, currently a furniture store, is one of the oldest structures in New York City, planned specifically to exhibit motion pictures originally called photoplays. Located at the southeast corner of Broadway and 135th Street, the theater opened in November 1914. Commissioned by Arlington C. Hall and Harvey M. Hall of the Wayside Realty Company, it was designed in a Neo-Renaissance style by Gaetano Agello, an architect best known for apartment buildings on Manhattan's Upper West Side. The building has three distinct fronts, including a clipped corner facade where the auditorium's entrance was originally located. The corner consequently received the most elaborate decorative treatment and is embellished with an elegant low-relief depicting an early motion picture camera set on a tripod. Harlem Hospital is a 272-bed, public municipally owned teaching hospital founded in 1887. It is located at 506 Lenox Avenue on the corner of 135th Street in the Harlem community. Administratively, Harlem Hospital Center is a member of the New York City Health and Hospitals Corporation. It is designed as a Level 1 trauma center and an area-wide burn center that includes a specialty in plastic and reconstructive surgery to reduce the scoring unique to the African American community. Harlem Hospital Center is an important social, political, and economic force within the community and is one of the largest U.S. training centers for minority and female physicians. On September 20th, 1958, as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was signing his newly published book at a Harlem bookstore, a 42-year-old woman, apparently deranged, suddenly started screaming and plunged a knife into the civil rights leader's chest. He was taken to Harlem Hospital, where a surgeon operated on him successfully. King's life was saved. The Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture is a national research library devoted to collecting, preserving, and providing access to resources documenting the experiences of people of African descent throughout the world. The center's collections first won international acclaim in 1926 when a personal collection of the distinguished Puerto Rican-born black scholar Arturo Alfonso Schomburg was added to the Division of Negro Literature, History, and Prints of the 135th Street branch of the New York Public Library. Schomburg served as curator from 1932 until his death in 1938. Renamed in his honor in 1940, the collection grew steadily through the years. In 1972, it was designated as one of the research libraries of the New York Public Library and became the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. Today, the Schomburg Center contains over 5 million items and provides services and programs for constituents from the United States and abroad. 125th Street is considered the main street of Harlem. It is also called Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard. Many sections of the streets have been gentrified and developed with such stores as MAC Cosmetics, Old Navy, H&M, CVS Pharmacy, and Magic Johnson Theaters. The historic Apollo Theater is here. In collaboration with the community, the city has developed a plan for the 125th Street corridor, focusing on reinforcing and building upon its strengths as an arts and cultural corridor. A rift in the crust runs along underneath the street and is known as the 125th Street Fault. The fault line creates a fault valley deep enough to require the IRT Broadway 7th Avenue line to become a trestle bridge between 122nd and 135th Streets. The street in the 18th century was called the Hollow Way. As we travel on 125th Street, we come upon the Magic Johnson Theaters. Magic Johnson Theaters are a chain of movie theaters originally developed in 1994 by Johnson Development Corporation, the business holding of basketball player turned entrepreneur Magic Johnson. The focus of Magic Theaters was to build first-rate multiplexes in urban communities, bringing high-quality facilities and technology as well as job development, encouraging local economic growth. While Magic Theaters are patterned after the Lowe's Cineplex entertainment model, they retain the Magic name and focus on urban markets. Each complex is around 60,000 square feet with multiple concession areas, 10 to 15 screens with SDDS stereo sound, stadium seating, and a capacity of 3,200 to 5,000. After building the Magic Theater in Harlem, multiple businesses followed suit, including Old Navy and Disney. Across 125th Street, we have the Apollo Theater. The Apollo Theater in New York City is one of the most famous music halls in the United States, and the most famous club associated almost exclusively with African American performers. It is listed on the National Register of Historic Places and is the home of Showtime at the Apollo a nationally syndicated variety show consisting of new talent. The theater is located at 253 West 125th Street in Harlem, one of the United States' most historically significant, traditionally African-American neighborhoods. The Apollo became famous for launching the careers of artists such as Ella Fitzgerald, Billie Holiday, James Brown, Diana Ross and the Supremes, Gladys Knight and the Pips, the Jackson 5, Patti LaBelle, Marvin Gaye, Luther Vandross, Stevie Wonder, Aretha Franklin, Benny King, Mariah Carey, and the Isley Brothers. The club fell into decline in the 1960s and 70s and was converted into a movie theater in 1975. The Apollo was revived in 1983 when Inner City Broadcasting, a firm owned by former Manhattan Borough President Percy E. Sutton, purchased the building. It obtained federal, state, and city landmark status and fully reopened in 1985. In 1991, the Apollo was purchased by the state of New York. On December 15, 2005, the Apollo Theater launched the first phase of its refurbishment, costing an estimated $65 million. On December 28, 2006, the body of James Brown, who had died a few days before, was displayed at an Apollo Theater memorial covered heavily by the news media. Also, a memorial for Michael Jackson was also set at the Apollo, attended by thousands. The Adam Clayton Powell Jr. State Office Building is a state of New York office building located on 125th Street. This 12-foot-high bronze statue honoring civil rights activist and Harlem Congressman Adam Clayton Powell Jr. was unveiled in the plaza of the Adam Clayton Powell Jr. State Office Building in 2005. Called Higher Ground, the monument by sculptor Brantley Cadet was inspired by a quote from the late minister and politician: "Press forward at all times, climbing forward toward the higher ground of the harmonious society that shapes the laws of men to the laws of God." The Reverend Adam Clayton Powell Jr., born on November 28, 1908, and died on April 4, 1972, was the first African American to ascend to a position of power in the United States Congress. The office building at 55 West 125th Street is the home of Bill Clinton's New York offices. The Clinton office is located on the top 2 floors of the building. When he moved in 2001, there was a huge celebration to welcome him to the neighborhood. As we turn down Fifth Avenue, we come upon Marcus Garvey Park, or Mount Morris Park, as it is referred to by the people in the neighborhood. The 20-acre park interrupts the flow of Fifth Avenue, which is routed around the park via Mount Morris Park West. The park is bounded by 120th Street and 124th Street and by Madison Avenue on its east side. The park is operated and maintained by the New York City Department of Parks and Recreation. Originally named Mount Morris Park, in 1973 the park was renamed for Marcus Garvey. The name change did not arise from a grassroots movement in the community, but rather it was a political maneuvering by Major John Lindsay to initiate himself with the communities of Upper Manhattan. The new name for the park honored Garvey, a publisher, journalist, entrepreneur, crusader for black nationalism, and founder of the Universal Negro Improvement Association and African Communities League. The park was opened to the public in 1840. In the summer of 1969, the park was the site of the Harlem Cultural Festival, a series of concerts that came to be known as Black Woodstock. The Harlem Fire Watchtower was designed by Julius H. Kroll and erected in 1857 of cast iron. The tower was fitted with a 10,000-pound bell. The watchtower allowed observers to use the natural elevation of the park and the added height of the structure to search for fires in an era when most buildings were made of wood. The 47-foot cast iron tower is the only one to survive of 11 that had been constructed in the city and was designated as a landmark in 1967. The watchtower is located at the center of the park on the artificial plateau called the Acropolis. As we come down Fifth Avenue, we come to Duke Ellington Circle. The sculpture of Edward Kennedy Ellington at 110th Street and 5th Avenue is the first monument in New York City dedicated to an African American and the first memorial to Ellington. A composer, orchestra conductor, and musician, Duke Ellington elevated jazz to the most American of art forms. Colorful blues-oriented players such as Johnny Hodges and Cootie Williams played with him, helping to shape his style and inspire his compositions. With Harlem and the Cotton Club as his home base, Ellington began radio broadcasts and recorded for American, English, and French labels. Increasingly recognized as a major American composer, he received the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1969. On July 1, 1997, Robert Graham's Duke Ellington Memorial was unveiled at the northeast corner of Central Park. Politicians, dignitaries, and Harlem neighborhood residents celebrated the culmination of an effort begun in 1979.